Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel, where today we are talking about Fred and Maria Manning, who were a Victorian couple who committed murder together. So enough of the intro, let's get on with it and let's put some makeup on his face and talk about this case. That is so cheesy. So I'll start by saying that it was quite difficult to get information on this case, and that's because it is a Victorian case, and a lot of the time in those days, the only way you found out about things was newspapers. So if there wasn't a lot written about a case or specific details written about a case, then you just never know. Frederick George Manning was born in 1819 in Taunton, Devon, England. Although I think he might have been called George Frederick Manning and just changed the George and the Fred around. This is quite a common thing. Like, I actually know quite a few older people who do that with their name. And, you know, I'm glad that it's not a trend anymore. Otherwise, I'd be called Lynn Jenner and forgot to put my earrings in. When Fred was old enough to work, he started working on the railways. This often took him to London, and he eventually worked his way up to the position of guard on the Great Western Railways. Unfortunately, his father died in 1845, but he did leave some inheritance for Fred, which was £400, which doesn't sound like a lot, but in today's money, that's roughly £13,000. Maria was born as Marie Larue in Lausanne, Switzerland in 1821. Her parents died around the year 1840, and she moved to England to become a maid. She also changed her name from Marie to Maria. It's believed that at the time this was more appealing to the English. There wasn't actually a lot that I could find about Maria, and not a lot is known about her life in general. So this would lead writers, after the crime was committed, writers would write about her and they would just make up things about her life. So it's quite hard to pick out the bits of truth between the fiction. In 1843, at age 22, she became a maid for Lady Polk, who was the wife of MP Sir Lawrence Polk. It is around this time that Maria is thought to have met a man named Patrick O'Connor from County Tipperary, Ireland. He was 22 years older than Maria, but this didn't stop them from having an on-off relationship for around 6 or 7 years. Patrick worked as a customs inspector, but he was a little bit shady, so he actually made quite a lot of money from this job. It's thought that Maria met Fred Manning sometime around 1845, and although it's not confirmed how they met, it's speculated that they met on the Great Western Railway. Fred and Maria started courting or started seeing each other, but she was also seeing Patrick at the same time. After Lady Polk passed away, Maria went into the service of Lady Blantyre, and she lived in Stafford House, which was a huge stately home in London. Lady Blantyre's father was the Duke of Sutherland, so Queen Victoria was a regular visitor at the house, as were all the rich and the elite of the British Empire at the time. Both Frederick and Patrick separately boasted to their friends about this, because it wasn't something that happened a lot. In the working class community, they were able to say, my girl Maria rubbed shoulders with the Queen. According to letters between Maria and Patrick, she was getting quite annoyed that he just wasn't proposing to her, and he kind of refused and said that he never would propose to her. So in 1847, when Fred proposed to Maria, she accepted. The pair were married in St James's Church in Piccadilly, London. Very shortly after they married, Patrick sent Maria a letter declaring his eternal love for her and informing her that he was going to propose, but just as he was, Fred proposed to her. So although this probably wasn't true, this is something that played on Maria's mind for a really long time. Soon after the couple were married, Fred was suddenly fired from his job, and it's not clear why, but it's been speculated that it was a possibility that he was accused of being in a robbery. They decided to move back to Fred's hometown of Taunton in Devon, and they bought an inn called the White Hart, which is still there to this day. well, I hope it's going to be there to this day. Like, obviously the pandemic has kind of screwed things quite a lot for pubs, so hopefully we don't lose our pubs, because it's part of our culture, our history, and that's a whole other subject. So even though they had only just really got married, apparently Maria would still see Patrick and she would go off and stay with him for days at a time. But also Fred was having multiple affairs, so they're kind of as bad as each other anyway. In 1849, there were two men that were involved in a very large robbery. Their names were Henry Paul and Edward Nightingale. Unfortunately, they were friends of the Mannings and often stayed at their inn. And also, unfortunately for Fred, Edward would often use his name as an alias instead of using his own name. So obviously that did not help Fred at all. The media got involved in this story, and even though the Mannings were cleared of all involvement, their reputation was ruined. So their business started to go downhill, and they decided to cut their losses and move back to London. They briefly owned a pub called the King John's Head in London, but that didn't last very long either. Eventually they settled in Minver Place in Bermondsey, London. Maria worked as a dressmaker, and they would also take in lodgers, but Fred didn't have a job. Don't know why, but he just didn't get a job. One of their lodgers was a man named William Massey, and he was a medical student, and he had a very unusual encounter with Fred one day. As Fred didn't work, he spent most of his time getting drunk, and he would ask William some very interesting questions. He would ask questions about chloroform, the effects of chloroform and other drugs, and one day he asked, "Would someone sign a cheque if you asked after you drugged them?" This obviously absolutely terrified William, and he was out there, he was gone, he moved out. I don't blame him, because I would too. It was known by all of the lodgers at the time and any friends of the couple that Maria was still seeing Patrick. And also Fred knew that she was still seeing Patrick, and he obviously wasn't very happy about it. On the 10th of August 1949, Patrick didn't turn up for work at the London docks. And although he was like this shady, bit dodgy character, he was very reliable in his job, and he always turned up for work on time. One of his colleagues was a man named William Flynn, and he was also Patrick's cousin, and he got very worried when he didn't turn up the next day as well. Because of this, William went to where Patrick lived, and instead of finding Patrick there, he found two of his friends. They said that on the Thursday they met Patrick, and he told them that he had been invited to dinner by his girl, Marie. When they asked his landlady about this, she said that Maria Manning had visited the apartment on Thursday evening and Friday evening, but she didn't see Patrick on either occasion. That was enough to make Patrick concerned enough to go to the police. The police went to the Mannings' house the next day, and they talked to Maria. Fred wasn't there. She told them that Patrick didn't come for dinner in the end, and she visited his apartment on Thursday and Friday because she thought that he might be unwell, because it wasn't like him to just not turn up. Well played, Maria, well played. William, though, was convinced that something had happened to his cousin, so he started giving out leaflets or flyers with a £10 reward on it for any information about Patrick and his whereabouts. He began to fear the worst, though, and he felt even worse when there were reports that Maria was seen with luggage in her hands leaving her house, but then she wasn't seen going back into her house, so she had fled. The police went to the Mannings' house again, and obviously the Mannings weren't there, so they decided to search the house, and they found nothing. They even dug up the garden, and they still found nothing. And you know, they were thinking, we're not going to find anything here. They were about to give up when they noticed that the flagstones in the kitchen, something was a bit off about them. So flagstones are, so obviously there was no like tiles or lino or whatever back in those days. They just had really big stones, and this is what their floor was. And one of the stones had recently been cleaned because it was a lot cleaner than all of the other stones around it. So they decided maybe we should have a look underneath the stone. So they picked it up and they started digging. And then when they got to about a foot down, that's when they found Patrick's body. He was dead, he was naked, and he was covered in quicklime. So it was believed at the time that quicklime would speed the decomposition of a body, but in fact it did the total opposite. But it did hide the smell of the decomposition, and that's why they covered him in quicklime. Patrick had a bullet wound to the back of his head, but this would not have killed him. It only would have cracked his skull. So the cause of death was actually blunt force trauma, and this would have been multiple blows to the head. The press got hold of this story, obviously, and they absolutely loved it. They focused mainly on Maria because she was a woman, and women murderers were always more sensational and would sell more newspapers. Rumours were wildly spreading about Maria, again because not a lot was known about her, but you know, the rumours of her motives, what could have happened, and that she forced poor old Fred to help bury her victim. Unfortunately for Maria, the police also focused on her because she was easier to track. After committing the murder, I'm not sure how long after, she went to London Bridge Station, where she left some boxes, and in these boxes were blood-stained clothes, letters between her and Patrick, and some documents that were in Patrick's apartment. From there, she went to Euston Station, where she got a train, first class, to Edinburgh. Maria was staying in Edinburgh, and that's where she tried to convert some stocks into cash. And of course, these were stolen stocks from Patrick, and they were reported as stolen. So, you know, the guy that she was seeing, the stockbroker, reported this to the police. She was arrested in Edinburgh and then she was extradited back to London. Fred, however, was proving a little bit more difficult to track down. He made his way to Waterloo Station and then he effectively disappeared. Unlike Maria, Fred was not a very distinctive character. He was 5'8", which was average for that time. He had fair hair and he had a ruddy complexion. So when the police put out his description, all the sightings they got back were false sightings. And these came from across the whole country. On the 29th of August, nearly 2 weeks into their search, they finally got a solid lead. Someone had recognised Fred on a steamship to Jersey, and this is where Fred was hiding out. He did have plans to go on further to France, but he ended up just getting too drunk to go. He was still in Jersey when the police arrived, but it took them several days to track him down, which is a bit confusing because Jersey's like a small island. Smallish. He was arrested on the 30th of August, having managed to evade arrest for an extra 9 days more than his wife. Woo! Maria remained silent during her arrest, but Fred did not. He immediately began trying to lay the groundwork for his defence. He asked if his wife had been arrested and was over the moon to find out that she had been. His story was that Maria killed Patrick and he was completely innocent. And when police asked him, how could Maria lift up those heavy stones off the floor, put a fully grown man into the floor, bury him, and then put the stones back on top of him, all by herself? Fred, don't know, he was stumped. The investigators were happy enough to let him just keep talking because they thought if we pin them two against each other, we're likely to get a conviction for both of them as opposed to just one of them. So with this being said, it's actually thought that what happened was Maria wanted to leave Fred for Patrick, but Patrick didn't really want that. He was happy with their little arrangement how it was, and this hurt Maria, and she thought, you know what, this is the final straw. So she managed to say to Fred, and remember he was like always drunk at this point, so he's going to be more easily led, and he hated Patrick. She managed to persuade him, if we murder Patrick, then we can take all of his money, all of his valuables, all of his stocks that I know are stashed in his house. Then she would have invited him round for dinner, and this is when the plan would have come together and they would have killed Patrick. Of course, no one knows what actually really happened, but this is like the main speculation of what happened. So as I said before, the press mainly focused on Maria for the Bermondsey horror, as they called it. She was attractive, she was foreign, she served in noble households. It's almost like she was tailor-made for the press. Best of all for them, though, is that she was calm and collected, or what they would call cold and calculated. Women of the time were, generally expected to be very emotional, to be like fainting, like, and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, at that time. And she was not. She was very calm, very cool as a cucumber. It actually reminds me of a case that I did before, and it was about the last woman to hang in the UK. Similar thing for her. She came across cold or whatever, but she was just very calm in court, and this did not help her in her case. It's kind of a similar thing. There was one interesting fact that emerged from the inquest, and that was from the former lodger William Massey. He said that in addition to the disturbing conversations he had with Fred, he said that the Mannings had actually told him that Patrick O'Connor had left the majority of his apartment to Maria in his will. There was also evidence that the Mannings bought a shovel and the quicklime just before the murder was committed, or like a couple of days before. Now, this evidence in particular was important because at the time, the law was that a wife could not be charged as the accessory after the fact for a murder by her husband, as it was presumed that her loyalty was to him first. So basically, if a man committed a crime and his wife helped bury the victim and cover it up, she would not get arrested because it was her duty to obey her husband and to be loyal to him. Interesting. It's not that anymore, by the way. The trial would need to show that she had prior knowledge of the planned crime, or that she took a direct part in the crime, or that she acted on her own initiative to profit from the planned crime. So this became the most important part of what they were trying to prove. They knew that they did it, but this is the part that they were really trying to prove. The trial took place at the Old Bailey in London, and Maria was represented by William Ballantyne and Fred was represented by Charles Wilkins. Ballantyne did his best to try and get Maria a separate trial on the grounds that because she was a foreigner, she should have half British citizens and half foreign citizens. So they should technically have separate trials. But this was denied on the grounds that because she married Fred, who is English, she is now an English citizen. So the joint trial began. Key points for the prosecution were Maria's bloodstained clothes and the fact that the quicklime was bought before the murder. They kind of just took Fred's guilt for granted, really. Didn't really put up a massive prosecution case. They just, made out that he was guilty. Maria's attorney tried to use the element of time to defend her, saying that when Patrick was last seen and when she was at his apartment, the times don't match. She couldn't have committed the murder. But then the prosecution said, well, she could have murdered him when she got back from his apartment. So the jury only took 45 minutes to deliberate and to find Fred and Maria Manning guilty of murder. Before passing sentence, the pair were asked if they had any last words, which weirdly was a tradition back then. Fred didn't want to speak at all, but Maria did. Apparently she spoke for ages about the injustice against a foreigner, and she continued to speak while the judge was passing his sentence, which was death for both Fred and Maria. She continued to yell as she was led away, and she apparently broke down once she got into her cell. Because of this, she was actually put under watch for the guards so that she didn't try and kill herself before her execution. With the trial done, the newspapers were free to fill in the gaps and sum up the case. and all of them concluded, based on no evidence whatsoever, that Maria had planned the whole thing and poor old Fred was just along for the ride. In a last-ditch attempt to escape her fate, Maria wrote letters to her old employers to try and get a pardon issued by the Queen, but her letters were sent back unopened, so I don't think they cared. Maria did actually try and kill herself on the morning of her execution, but the guards spotted this and they stopped her. Not because they cared, but because her death was to be public entertainment with a crowd of thousands of people there to watch her. I still think that's a really disgusting time in our history, that people used to go and watch executions for entertainment. I can't think of anything worse than watching someone die, but they were different times. One of those present in the crowd was actually Charles Dickens, and he attended not to watch the execution, but to watch the crowd watching the execution. And later he wrote,
Thousands upon thousands of upturned faces, so inexpressibly odious in their brutal mirth or callousness, that a man had cause to feel ashamed of the shape he wore, and to shrink from himself as fashioned in the image of the devil.
He was good, wasn't he? In fact, the crowd got so overexcited, and it was effectively a Victorian mosh pit, that one woman got crushed to death and 2 men got severely injured just waiting to watch this execution. That's crazy. So it's before this crowd that Fred and Maria were brought out together, and they died together on the hangman's scaffold. It was tradition at the time that bodies that had died in this way were buried in the prison, and the ground was lined with quicklime. So the Mannings lay to rest in the same condition that they left Patrick in, which is very ironic. So that's everything on today's case. I hope you enjoyed that one. It's not a lot of pictures, not a lot of evidence, but it's interesting with these Victorian crimes, or I find them interesting anyway. So let me know if you want to see any cases in particular from me, and I will see you in my next video.